Okay, can I have a mover and a seconder to call this meeting to order? Austin and Allen? That the special meeting of the Council of the Township of Springwater, February 20th, 2018, come to order at 1:02 p.m. All those in favor? Carried. And I'll turn, is there any disclosure of any pecuniary interest in the matter that we're going to be dealing with today? Well, if you discover something as we go, just note it at that time. And so we have a presentation today from Watson and Associates on development charges background study, and maybe I'll just go to Director Schmidt for a brief introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of council. You may recall back in 2017, as part of our budget process, there was funds set aside for the updating of our development charge background study and bylaw. We went through a request for proposal process, and through that process, staff recommended awarding to Watson and Associates, and council obviously endorsed that. And so, as part of the update of the development charges and bylaw, essentially part of the scope of that project is to actually have a session with council to kind of provide more of an educational piece on development charges and allow for an opportunity for you to ask direct questions to our consultant. So from Watson Associates, we have Gary Scanlon and Daryl Apps, who is conducting the work on behalf of the township. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Gary, and any questions you have, we'll do our best to answer those.
Thank you. Carry on, Gary.
Excellent, thank you. Pleasure to be before you. I'm happy while I'm presenting, if you want to stop me at any point and ask a direct question, it's probably a little better to do it at that point than trying to wait to the end. So this is just a quick summary of where we're at in the process. We initiated in early October, and we've been undertaking staff interviews with respect to all the different servicing standards, growth, etc. We're having tomorrow a stakeholder discussion similar to this, just to give them some perspectives, talk about what we've talked to you about. The charges, the calculation should actually be available in March, and we're looking to release the background study towards the end of March, with the public meeting set for April 18th, and then subsequent to that, the bylaw adoption. You'll note...
Gary, can I just interrupt for,
Yes.
okay, just for clarification for anybody that might be kind of observing our live streaming stakeholder meeting, because I got clarification this morning, but maybe you just want to explain who's going to be involved in the stakeholder meeting tomorrow.
Generally, the development community, members of the development community, invitations will be sent out to them just so they have an opportunity to talk. As we go through, I'll demonstrate there's a couple of tweaks or changes or refinements that we'll be making as a result of the changes that the province has made. So we want to make sure that they're clear on what those changes are, because it affects the bylaw. So,
Councillor Austin?
And could you tell us where that's going to be?
Director Schmidt?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Councillor Austin. So tomorrow's session will be the same time as today in the same in the council chambers. So from 1 to 3 p.m. in the council chambers.
But council's not involved in that.
It is not a council meeting. No, it's simply a stakeholder meeting to have a discussion with the development community to bring them up to speed on the process and to answer any preliminary questions that they may have.
Carry on.
excellent, thank you. The last point I was just going to make on this slide is if you take a look at the timelines between when we release the background study and when we adopt the bylaw, there's now a minimum 60 days. I guess through the discussions with the province, the development community wanted to ensure that they had adequate time to review these background studies. So the province has introduced a minimum 2-month process. So we've observed that, and that's why you can see such a distance between sending out the background study and bylaw and then finally adopting it. Development charges, just for everybody's, so everybody's on the same page. They're to recover infrastructure, capital costs that are associated with residential and non-residential growth. They're not to recover day-to-day operating costs. They're specifically for cost of infrastructure. For the most part, the development charge covered the broader infrastructure. There are still responsibilities of the individual developer that they pay 100% of the cost, and that's called a local service, and I'll be spending more time on that later. But the local service normally deals with internal roads, if you have sidewalks, water mains, sewers, street lights, etc. Those, stormwater management, those are what developers pay for 100% on their own because they're very localized. And then outside of that is what we normally include in the DC, so the broader treatment facilities, etc. So we have the Development Charges Act, which has been in place since 1989, but actually these types of charges have been around since the 1950s. So now they've been in place for almost 60, or actually over 60 years. We've had lot levies, have you heard about that term used? It was under the Planning Act, and you could only impose that charge when you created the lot through subdivision or severance. So that's where it got its nickname, lot levies. And then since 1989, we call them the Development Charges Act. This kind of summarizes, that's, yes, sir.
Councillor McConkey?
I just have a question on the purpose where we say sidewalks and we say internal roads. Where I have an issue with that, and I need to understand, is we would have a road that really leads into the subdivision. So I'm going to use Carson or Seaton Road. And I could use Sunnydale Road in another example. Some are owned by the county, some are owned by us. But they're actually the main corridor to lead to that subdivision. And yet we're not getting sidewalks on those roads. And with those roads, they're not inside the development, but they are the main artery to get to that subdivision. Should they be included for upgrades in the DC charges?
They could be. Normally, it depends whether the internal subdivision, if it has sidewalks and such. There can be works that go outside of the individual subdivision. The Act actually says within the plan or within the area to which the plan relates, which means you can go outside of the plan and impose certain costs. If I can wait until, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on local services.
Okay,
and
great.
it might be easier to describe
Okay.
it at
Thank
that
you.
particular point. So, as I noted, 1989 is when we had the first Development Charges Act actually put into place. Before that, it was all really defined through case law. And in 1989, they took all of that case law and basically put it together as a piece of legislation. In 1997, they did significant changes. So they reduced the services that you could collect for. They introduced service standard restrictions, mandatory reductions, exemptions, etc. So that for the most part, municipalities can collect only about 75, maybe 80% of the growth-related costs. And as I go through the presentation, you'll see how we get to that reduction. And at the end of 2015, they made a further change, which is referred to as Bill 73. And I'll go through those changes as well. Some were positive, I guess, from a municipal perspective, which allowed you to collect a little bit more money, and some were negative in that it probably has reduced in some areas your ability. So it's kind of on balance, probably the same amount. So as I go through, I'll touch base on those changes to Bill 73, because obviously those are different from what you experienced last time in your DC study, but what you have to adhere to this time. Anything that is in red is where that change has been made for Bill 73. So I talked about limitations on services, and these are what were the services that were eliminated in the 1997 Act. Headquarters for the general administration of the municipality. So basically any space related to council, the clerks, probably finance, if you got a legal department, CAO, those type of administrative functions are basically removed from having a DC. Arts, cultural, museum, entertainment facilities, so almost all the arts and culture were completely eliminated. The only one that was allowed to continue was libraries. So we can collect for the facilities as well as the books. Tourism-related facilities were eliminated, and that would include economic development. We used to be able to collect to provide for the cost of expanding local hospitals, given that if you work through, probably 40 to 45% of the cost of a hospital has to be raised locally. We used to collect DCs to assist, but we can no longer do that. Parkland acquisition has been eliminated, I guess because under the Planning Act you can get land dedications. They've deemed that that should be adequate for your purposes of parkland. Actually, what's happened though, however, is over time as we're moving towards denser and denser subdivisions, so when they first put the legislation into place, you probably had 5 lots on an acre. Now you're down to something along the lines of 10 lots for an acre. And if you're taking 5% of the land for parkland dedication, you've doubled the amount of people that need parkland, but they really haven't changed the Planning Act provisions. So this is an area that's caused a lot of concern because municipalities are getting more and more pressure to provide the parkland, especially with smaller and smaller lots. You haven't got the backyards to play in. So, and then the last one was waste management services. I know this is provided at the county, but it was in 1997 completely eliminated. Subsequent to that, they've just introduced the ability to recover for waste diversion. So recycle, reuse, organics, that type of thing we can collect for, but not landfill or incineration. They're still exempted services. Capital cost, basically the list, if you take a look here, is basically anything that you would include as part of a capital project. You approve a project, any of the approvals, the design, any of the engineering works, any of the cost of buying the land, etc., even furnishing the buildings, basically 100% can be included in the DC. Even if you have to go out and borrow to cash flow, debenture to pay for that building, we can include the interest as well in that cost. Studies, whether they be for planning purposes like official plans, secondary plans, DC studies, any type of master plans, even locational studies, where am I going to locate the next fire station, etc. All of those type of studies can be included in the development chart. So this was a change where we got broader definitions in 1997, and actually it's quite positive. A couple of things that they did remove was vehicles and equipment. You have to meet a test of keeping those vehicles and equipment on average for at least 7 years. I think what they wanted was to ensure that these are the bigger pieces of equipment. We're not doing weed whippers or hammers or screwdrivers, something like that. They want more of the major equipment to be included. And there was, if you read the act, it talks about exempting computer equipment. This has caused some problems because obviously in 1997, your definition of computer equipment is completely different than as of today. Back then it was eliminating things like big servers, big mainframes, as we used to call them back in those days. Now there's been some OMB hearings that have assisted in us defining what that means. And actually it's been quite positive in the definition. If the computers are integral to the provision of the service, then we can include them. So that means the challenge, the big challenge that one of the big studies on this area was a sewage treatment plant, and the developers who were appealing wanted to eliminate either the whole plant or take out a sizable chunk of cost because computers were exempt. And actually they were going after, well, you can also figure, with vehicles and equipment, they're all computerized now. So it went to quite a bit of a messy type of hearing. At the end of the day, the board member came back with a very rational decision and said if it's integral to the provision of the service, then it's included. Yes.
Councilor Conkey?
So with software development for water meter and that, and also software, we have to buy more equipment and we have to manage our snow plows and stuff to see where they're going because we haven't got this much. Would that be included?
I would think so. I mean, if it's certainly for police vehicles, you know, they're out on the road, and now they've got the, you know, the computerized information terminals so that they can operate, do their job. They would be included, I think, libraries, if the, you know, we don't do those long card drawers anymore. They're out on the front. So I think it's, you know, if it's integral to the provision of the service, I think that's the determining word.
You just mentioned something about library, and I think it's very important because libraries are changing and they're going towards kiosks. And I know that they cost quite a bit of money, and the library has been looking into costs of that. And so it might be something that our council may want to consider, because I know that the library has been investigating, because I asked on that. And I know we're looking at a kiosk that was in the library plan for menacing areas, so we may want to look at that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good example of how certain services are evolving over time. I mean, you, instead of going to the library and picking a physical book, you now have online services where you can rent the book or download the book for 3 weeks type of thing. So we include those as well. So I think that, you know, any of those type of items, as I say, it's integral to the provision of the service, and we have to recognize things are changing over time. Yep. So the first bullet talked about some of the deductions we have for the capital items. There's also broader deductions. All services that you provide, with the exception of water, wastewater, storm, roads, police, and fire, and then just recently we've added transit. All other services, we get to the end of the calculations and you knock off an extra 10%. So we get to the bottom of all these calculations, and the Act says remove another 10%, and that's something that has to be paid for by the taxpayer. The reasoning behind it, I think, generally was, I guess the province thought it was important for municipalities to have some skin in the game, and that's why they included it. So that adds to the, as I say, the 25% non-recoverable on DCs across the board.
Sorry about this, but you say that the DCA provides for mandatory 10% reduction, and you include police in there. So my assumption would be that DC's covered for police then?
Yes. All
So-
services except for the ones that I had on the prior page.
Because I've never seen any collection of DCs for police. I know we have a different structure right now, but honestly, for my constituents, they want a different type of policing, and we're going to need it. And I think we have to look at that as well.
Maybe just some clarification. Is this not intended for municipalities to actually have their own policing rather than we have a fee for service with the OPP?
Correct.
So, you know, and it's obviously the OPP. I'm just suggesting, you know, is that what the difference is?
No, I mean, if you look at this definition on capital costs, you can see, if I go to here, acquire, lease, okay, or capital component of a lease for the above. So within those, that leased service, and that's what you would have with the OPP, we quite often would include, and we try and understand whether they'll be expanding additional vehicles, officers, because it costs about $5,000 or $6,000 to equip an officer. And as well, maybe you need to expand building space. They may be doing either community offices, storefronts, or maybe they need to have an expanded building, and you have to contribute towards that. Yes, we could include it. Now, that has to be under your jurisdiction if it's run at the county level. And okay. Planning horizon for most services is 10 years. So when we're looking at those services, we can't go past a 10-year planning horizon. That doesn't apply to the water, wastewater, storm, roads, police, and fire. We can use any planning horizon for that. Obviously, for water, wastewater, it's easier if we take a look at the servicing envelope, and and that may take 15 years, 20 years, or whatever to build out. So a lot of times it's easier to take a look at that as a servicing. And as well, like roads and say fire or even police, they're better looked at on a 20-year planning horizon, not a shorter term. You have a better understanding of it.
So what I'm hearing from you is that we really have to understand our operational costs as well as our capital costs. So like if you take fire, we're going to change the way we operate our fire department, like it's all volunteer. As we go progress into 10 or 15, 20 years, same as our policing, we have to start to look at the operational costs, the same as our library and that. Thank you very much. That's the answer. Thank you very much.
You obviously, as the things change, you do have to look at operations. A place like Milton, when they were 32,000 people, they had volunteer service. They're now 120, and they've moved to significantly towards full-time firefighting. That translates into different buildings, and it may be less firefighters, so you may be saving on the amount of bunker gear, but it's normally translated into bigger buildings, the requirements for sleeping accommodations and stuff like that.
If we have to go into that detail and we need a resource to do that because of this development, can we DC that resource?
Can you clarify what a resource is? If you need
Okay, so I know
background
that-
studies?
Yeah, we need some background studies on the operational part. Can we put that into a DC study? Sorry.
Yes, the study you can, even though it's crossing into operations, that's part of the functionality of the service, that's okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, just. No, I'm lost.
Nope.
Nope, is that the right one? Okay, sorry.
Well, I had a question on this slide,
Yes,
or actually this,
the one before, or this one?
no, so, okay, it's actually something next one.
So this one, just to finish it off, the capital costs have to be reduced by any grant subsidies, other contributions. There's not as much there as there was in 1997. 1997, we had 15% for any water or sewer project, 50% for roads, 75% for transit, 5% for parks and recreation. These days, it's nominal and it's more ad hoc. So and a lot of times we don't even know what the programs are when we do it. So what we include in the DC normally is nominal in this area, unless you've got some authorization for that. And then as we note, the cost can either be by yourself, so incurred by yourself, or they're provided by others. So maybe you're purchasing a service off of an adjacent municipality. Places like Aurora and Newmarket co-share fire services. So, we prorate off their costs and as an example. So there's you don't have to necessarily be the author of it, but you're purchasing the service, and that goes back in part to your lease example as well for the OPP. Service standards are what provides a limitation on what you can collect. Basically, the Act says what you charge in the future can be no higher than the average level of service you've provided over the past 10 years. And we have to do these quality quantity measures, and they translate into a ceiling that we can't go past. Now, these don't apply to water, wastewater, and storm because they're environmental. They have environmental legislation that overrides it. Obviously, after Walkerton, the water legislation is quite powerful. So we don't have to do this service standard calculation for it. And then for transit, you can see it's noted in red. They're now doing a forward-looking service standard. And the purpose of that is obviously if you have no transit right now, but you're going to grow from 19,000 to 50,000, let's say, over a period of time, normally in the 25 to 30,000 range, it activates the need to move towards transit. So if you were looking forward in introducing transit, that backwards-looking service standard would inhibit you. And that's what municipalities are finding. So they've introduced a forward-looking service standard, which is positive from, I guess, from a perspective of being able to collect money in certain instances. But it causes a lot more calculations to it, because you really need in some part, a transportation engineer assisting us in those calculations.
Councilman Conkey?
I guess my question is to the county councilors, because we know that they're working on transit for Simcoe County, but they didn't really offer any service that would help from the Elmvale down to the development area or whatever. We don't have a lot of transit in Springwater itself. So since we don't have transportation today, are we still, like, if we need it in the future? And it's my understanding that we can look at that and expand upon it?
It could be.
Yeah, right now, at the county level, the county is collecting DCs for their transportation, but they have a plan that comes into play, and as a matter of fact, one of the routes, when you see the finalized route, it's actually the hub's going to be at RBH Georgian College, and it's actually going to travel St. Vincent Street, and then Mill Road out to 26, and then up to 27 Elmwood. Yes, yeah, they changed some of the routing and that. But I think back to your point, our transportation plan doesn't really have a concrete when we would ever have any local connections or local, like even a bus or two. I think if I look at the master transportation plan as part of our EA, so that's something we probably should be reviewing, because again, that's not limited to the 10-year or whatever. We could project that over the lifespan of the build-out, which is probably 15, 20 years.
Yeah, with specifically with transit, you have a 10-year calculation period, but you have to look out 20 years, because they want you to take a look at excess capacity in your buses and make sure that you're allocating appropriately to the next 10 years. So if you were at the point of being able to advance that, we can modify the bylaw anytime, but you need to be at a certain point in order to initiate that process.
I find the sentence where it says, previously provided the DCD no higher than the highest level attained over the previous 10-year period. Yet we
Talked about today, we have volunteer fire. Tomorrow, we'll need full-time, or within 10 years, we need full-time. So how does that sentence relate to going back to my fire or my police?
It translates into, I mentioned quality quantity, and if we take a look here, quality quantity, we list all the different buildings. Did we put an example in? No, we didn't. We for a building, we would list all the different buildings. Maybe a building, one of them's concrete and it's built at $200 a square foot. Maybe one's marble and it's built at $300 a square foot. Even though the same square footage, the cost would be different. So you need to list all of these and look at the building quality, the replacement cost in essence. And then once you have the replacement cost, I used a very simple example here of an arena. So, okay. Yeah, you can see it on both sides. Good. So an arena that had, let's say the value of it was $5,000. And what this is it says, okay, you divide by the population and you come up with a service standard. So this is for development charges only. It translates into a mathematical calculation, not translated into, full-time versus part-time. So that, with this, in this particular example, if we didn't add any more arena space, as you can see, as you grow, and you divide that 10,000 people into the 5 million, you get $500. As you grow, that service standard is actually dropping over time. So what what we have to do is we have to take those 10 years, total them together, and then divide by 10, and it comes up with $360 per capita. And we use that, if you're going to grow by 10,000, we take the 10,000 people and we times it by $360 per capita. And that's what gives us the ceiling on how much we can spend. You can put as much capital as you want in there, but I can't allocate more than that service standard into the calculation. And this is a change. If you can see, when we had it in 1989, it said what you charge in the future is no higher than the highest level you've attained, which would have said we can charge at the $500. But in 1997, they changed it to say the average. So just that one wording change, basically in this particular example, dropped them by 40% on what they can collect. And this sounds like this going from 10,000 to 20,000 or 19,000 over 10 years. Sounds like a huge rate of growth. But if you think of where Barrie was in the 80s, that's a good example. Milton is growing actually faster than this level. And what we experienced was their service standards plummeting. And we had to take other measures in order to readjust that. So we had to negotiate with the developers.
Yeah, Deputy Mayor Allen?
So how does this factor in inflation, the time value of money?
It's all in today's dollars. So the replacement cost is $5 million in this particular example would be the replacement value as of today. But the population obviously is whatever it was into the past. So it's as I say, it turns into a mathematical calculation, and it puts a dollar ceiling on how much we can recover from the developers.
So going forward, though, I mean, this is based on a historical calculation.
That's
but
correct.
going forward, is there an inflationary factor built into it?
Yes, your bylaw will automatically, we put in the inflationary clause, and it's StatsCan construction cost index that we use to index it every year. Some years it's gone up by 10%. So right now, the last 5 years, it's gone up by a little over 9.3%. So almost 2% per year. Okay.
Yeah, actually, just a quick follow-up on that, because I was going to ask on the last slide about the recreation. So recreation, this is a good example here. So we need a lot more really per lot, if you want to put it that way, for recreation, because we're looking, for example, at a $30 million recplex. We've never had one.
Right.
There was kind of two questions. That is a different type of service. Does that come into play? I mean, is there any argument against the fact that, okay, you've never had a recplex, but it would simply, go back to the new formula, service standard divided into the cost? Is that the way it would work?
We would, you have indoor recreation, which may be community halls, senior centers, perhaps an arena, perhaps indoor soccer facility. The service is defined at a very high level, so it's recreation. So then within recreation, you may have a variety of different types of facilities, and that's okay. So I had a council one time that were going through a recreation master plan, and they were split. There was 9 council members. 3 of them wanted a new arena, 3 wanted an indoor soccer facility, and 3 wanted a swimming pool. And I had to present this to them, and my answer to them is, whenever you decide which you want, it doesn't matter from the DC, because I can allocate it to whichever one, because it's indoor programmable time, so it's recreation space. So but the Act doesn't care, whether you have more emphasis on soccer versus pool versus hockey.
Actually, that's a good example. What happens, because we potentially may grow very quickly, probably like Milton, so we want all 3. So it still just simply gets factored by the service standard.
Well, yes, in the early stages, you'd be facing this reduction. If you haven't added anything in recent years, then you can see this service standard tends to drop. If you pre-built, then it tends to, send even though you'd have to issue debentures and stuff, what happens over time is the service standard jumps up quite dramatically. And then that allows you to basically increase the charge over time and increase your revenue to pay the debt charges. So, excuse me, at a very high level, the changes that were introduced that you wouldn't have experienced last time but are now there for this round of DCs are summarized here. So transit services, they removed the 10%, but it's a forward-looking service standard, so that's something you can consider in the future. We'd be able to include that, and that could be introduced at any time. Waste diversion, so they've introduced that. We still can't do, we can do recycle, reuse, but we can't do incineration or landfill. Ineligible services, it's a minor thing, but the province, formally in the Act, all those services that you can't collect for, they were actually defined in the Act. Well, they've popped them out and they put them into the regulations now. And as you're aware, you can change the regulations quite quickly. It only takes 45 days, you advertise it, and then you can move forward to change it. So some perceive that as, some municipalities perceive it as a positive because maybe we can reduce some of the services. Others probably consider it as a negative because that means you can add more exemptions quite quickly. So my discussions with the province, there's nothing on the horizon right now, but it just provides some flexibility into the future. One of the things DC studies now have to consider, area rating. You don't have to approve it, but it's something that you have to consider. And obviously, you do have area rating for water and wastewater, so you've already incorporated a lot of that into your calculations. We normally don't do it for for non-water wastewater storm. Like all the rest of the services, parks, recreation and stuff, we don't do it for those services, or we would not recommend doing it. And the reason is because you would actually lose revenue. If I go back to here, and I just use this $360, when you go into an area-specific calculation, I've got one area that's going to grow by 5,000 people, one by 10, one by 1,000. The limitations are that 1,000 or 10,000 or 5,000. If you do an area charge, I can't collect any more than the population times this 360. So maybe you've already built the arena over here, and now you want to build an arena over here. You would not be able to collect. You'd end up having the taxpayer pay for a large portion of it. But if you keep it as a municipal-wide charge, I can take the 16,000 people, multiply it by the 360, and get the revenue. So my recommendation is, for water, wastewater, and storm, it's easy to consider it. For all the other services, you're probably leaving money on the table. So that means there'll be a hit to the property taxes. So
Yeah, actually, I'll just go to Director Schmidt on this, because I know we do that with kind of recreation, except for, I guess, when the middle secondary plan, some DCs there, but when it comes to roads, there's specific and township-wide. Maybe just clarify some of our policies relative to what we're talking about.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to members of council. So I think Mr. Scanlon's mentioned it. This is essentially in our current DC background study or bylaw, the only area-specific development charges relate to a water and or a wastewater service. So we do have a township-wide, which includes general government or like administrative type studies. We have fire, we have indoor recreation, outdoor recreation, and roads is all included as a township-wide DC. It's only the water and or wastewater that's area-specific.
Just to complicate it, picking up kind of something from Councilor McConkey said. Now, I know in some of the Midhurst developments, there's going to be improvements on existing roads that are going to come from, if you want to call it area-specific DCs. Is that correct, or am I misunderstanding that?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, through you to members of council. So I think that's part of the discussion that we want to have with local service policy, whereby if the development is happening in Midhurst and there's already existing infrastructure there, but because the development is causing pressure on some of those existing, some of that is existing infrastructure, I think through the local service policy, we can hopefully deal with that, and/or development charges would be applicable. So,
Okay, I'll wait when we get to that point. Councillor Coghlan?
Thank you, Mayor French, and through you, going back to recreation, indoor and outdoor, the service standard level for Springwater relies on joint service agreements with the City of Barrie and others. So how is that numerical value included? Because we may be kicked out of Barrie, or that may carry on forever, but we can't provide our residents with what we are providing them now if that ends. So how do we collect for that?
You may have, well, I'll answer it in two parts. First part is you may have people that are going to Barrie using, participating in hockey leagues and stuff like that. And if it's just them registering and using the facilities, then there's not a lot I can do with DCs. Second part is if you're into an agreement where they say, you have to contribute towards the capital, you're paying for, 20% of the arena and stuff like that, then I can isolate those capital costs and bring them into the calculation. I guess it depends on the individual type of agreement you have and whether you're contributing capital to it. Those are kind of the two factors.
So thank you. So because our costs are more operational to us, the agreements for baseball diamonds and things like that, we provide a service to maintain in order to have access to it. So if we grow past that, how can we, the way I'm looking at it is we're only outputting operational costs without receiving any DC for future capital costs, because right now the standard is zero. Like we don't provide that. So how, in transit you can look forward, they have the future forward, but for recreation there isn't. So how do we do this then?
It's a good question. There's limitations. It's providing the service. As I say, we'd have to look into the individual agreements and see, whether you're actually purchasing the service to the extent. Keep in mind that if, for them, if we would have to reduce, I'll use Guelph and Wellington County share a lot of services, and they have parallel capital. I need to be mindful of what's being included in both of their bylaws to make sure that I'm not over collecting or under collecting, and I have to do cost sharing for both of their services. So with this, if there was anything that I was pulling into your calculations, then in theory there's a reduction on their side. And that's where we've got to look at the agreements to see what's the nature of that agreement. Are you paying for 20% of the arena? Are you paying for X number of baseball diamonds or for park facilities? Those are things that we'd look for.
Actually, so it may, in our plan, it may very well be advantageous for us to think long-term, and instead of building a pool or whatever, maybe our shared services agreement does include some contribution to the capital so we can retain the relationship and still have the facility the way we do today. So,
Sometimes it's, your operating costs may include, from their perspective, capital, but if you pay up front, reduce your operating, then, exactly.
Councillor Ritchie.
Thank you, Mayor French. We've entered into a partnership agreement with the Simcoe County School Board for the new addition at the high school. So this partnership agreement is $50,000 a year for 10 years, and that'll give us use to the new school. So that money that we're putting up, is that DC eligible? Because we're going to be putting programs, we're going to have use of that, this new school when it's ready, and I think in 2019.
Is that agreement in place now, or just
The partnership
coming?
agreement is in place. The addition is going ahead. It's being built as we speak.
All right,
We hope
then-
to move in 2019.
Then it might be helpful if I take a read of the agreement to see what's actually being agreed to, and there's an opportunity perhaps to include that.
The Director of Parks and Rec or our Director of Finance could accommodate that.
Well, we'll
I
take a
just
look
thought,
at.
mention it while
we'll look at
we're
this stuff.
doing it, so I,
No, that's a very valid point, because of the indoor rec, because that's going to provide a lot of that in Elmville. And basically, where we're funding it right now is from other means, and possibly it is DC eligible. Because I think in our discussions, when we passed the resolution, I don't think we talked about being DC eligible, or did we? Anyway.
somewhere
you-
along,
we
Mayor
can
Fred,
look
somewhere
into
along the line, it did come up about DC eligibility, but, you know, we're gonna have used to a double-wide gymnasium, there's gonna be fitness facilities there, there's, like, whatever they've got, we're gonna have the access to it, but the Director of Public Work, or of Parks and Rec could clarify that, but just want to mention it there as we're moving through the process.
We, you know, quite often we've included items with respect to schools where you've got these agreements, and maybe, you know, maybe they're you know, you're putting in some of the capital and you get 50% of the programming. So we would include 50% of that, the capital items in there. So this is something, there's some triggers that we have to look at, you know, what have you actually agreed to? You know, from if you get taken to the OMB, you've got the lawyers taking a look at it through a little microscope. So I wouldn't mind the opportunity to look at it, and I'd be able to advise you better.
And just for clarification, I know we've passed the funding and it's available and they're building and all that, but have we signed any actual agreement, CEO Brindley?
Mr. Mayor, no, we're, as Councillor Ritchie pointed out, we have a partnership agreement, but we don't have the user agreement yet, which I know that our director has been at it, and their challenge is they keep moving people around, but we've essentially given a deadline for May, but I have a feeling our deadline will be March now. But the other side of it, though, is I'm not sure if our friends can provide this, but once again, based on level of use, if you take this allocation and move it over to the library, you might not be able to have that same allocation to use for another facility because you only get so much allocation, like so much space. So that's something I will be asking our friends to talk about, because if we essentially say, okay, so much of our allotment we have through use is available for our next time period, you're essentially saying, okay, we're taking this chunk away, whereas we might need that chunk for later on for something else. So something to consider.
Yeah. Well, we'll have that conversation, and this, yep, that's a good, absolutely. So last couple of items, minor one, annual report to the treasurer. There's more enhanced reporting to make sure that there's more perceived transparency in the reports. Nothing significant. This is the one, no additional levies, is the one that is creating some issues. I think in essence there was, this is the situation where Barrie has asked for the developers to basically top up the development charge. And places like Milton and high growth municipalities have asked for those type of measures. What they've put into place really is restricting the mandating of that requirement. Okay, we're not going to, you know, until you guys sign it, we're not passing an official plan. So they're taking away the extortion or perceived extortion. Doesn't mean you have to allow that growth to proceed because you don't have the money, you're not going to build. So there are ways of moving ahead in a cooperative manner. Similar to what Barrie's done. If it's unaffordable, it's unaffordable. But where this is really hitting home is in what we talked about, that local service policy, because you have to define, the way the act is set up is it starts from almost like the pipe going into the house, and then like for the water main, and it tracks it all the way from the supply to treatment, to storage, to pumpage, to all the stuff. So there's this huge hierarchy of infrastructure. The Act then says at a certain point, you draw a line, and below that line, that's the developer's responsibility. So it's easy to say, okay, internal to the subdivision, that's your responsibility if you need pumping or whatever inside. And you can go outside and say, okay, you need to connect, and maybe you need like a very localized pumping station or something. It's only servicing you. And we can go outside of that property now and to do things like, perhaps include sidewalks or some type of road improvements and stuff like that. So that local service policy defines what the developer's responsibilities are. And then above that is what we include in the DC. The no additional levies, we're trying to be very clear at what the developer's responsibilities are, because if we miss out on something, if we're not clear enough, then it kicks into being a credit against the development charge. And there's a number of municipalities experiencing, we've been doing these type of things for a long time, having local service policies. Some municipalities don't have them, and they're now starting, after this no additional levy, starting to experience a lot of problems because the developers are saying, well, it's not my cost, you didn't define it, so I want a credit. So we're spending a lot of time working on this, and I'm going to come back to it in a minute to talk to you about it. But I'll come back there. That's a very powerful change that's been made in the legislation. Last two items, Minister has the power to impose area-specific charges. That says changes, it's really charges. But there's nothing in there right now. They haven't imposed mandatorily. This may be in certain instances, such as Toronto or something, they may do something. But they've included nothing right now, and then they did some minor housekeeping changes to the act. So I'll come back to the no additional levies shortly, because this is where we're spending a lot of time with staff to clarify those items. So you can see really the area rating is something we need to consider on your behalf, the no additional levies. And then it wasn't on the prior slide, probably should have been. There's a requirement to do asset management with the province moving ahead with the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act. They're looking at commenting on asset management in all of your reports. So there'll be a requirement for us to do some commentary, put a chapter in with respect to the new infrastructure that's included in the development charge. There are mandatory exemptions, so there's certain times where you cannot include, impose a development charge. That would include industrial buildings. So if I have a 100,000 square foot building, I can expand it to 150,000 square feet and not have to pay a charge. When they originally introduced this, there was the thought that that's in perpetuity. So that I can go from 100 to 150, take out another building permit, go from 150 to 225, and so on and so on. But we've had a very good decision, which basically says that you can draw a line in the sand and limit that exemption to one time, or to a 50%, and then after that, you're not going to get any more. So we can include that in your DC bylaw to provide that none of those adjustments are made past the original 50%.
Councillor McConkey?
So if we have a building that we're renovating to store equipment in, are we limited on how much we can collect the DCs on?
No, this is for imposing the charge. So this is a private entity that has, like a company, a corporation, that has maybe a warehouse, 100,000 square feet, and want to expand it to 150. Then for the first 50%, they don't pay a charge. But after that, you would expect them to start paying at a certain point.
So yeah, we need to decide on what that policy is in our DC.
That's correct.
Just a question, when it comes to industrial expansion, let's assume someone's got 100,000 square feet and they have enough property and they want to build a separate 50,000 square feet.
It's an expansion, which means it's being expanded off of the original. It's not an expansion on the lot, generally.
Yeah.
Some municipalities have written it in a manner that says we'll recognize the whole lot. That's something you could consider.
And so we could modify that, because I know there was one expansion that, because it wasn't joined, basically paid development charges. And
Yeah. And,
okay.
And I would consider it a real expansion. We've had some creative individuals that said that they would have a canopy in between the two buildings, hence it's an expansion. But Husky in Bolton tried that one, which was very interesting. So
I think it occurred in the south end of Barrie at Yom.
did it happen there too? So creative individuals, that's fair. That's if you never ask, you never receive. So. And then the next couple are basically for intensification. If I have a single-family home, I can add 2 additional apartments, and as long as I don't more than double the size of the original house, then no charge is paid. And if I have a medium or high density, so townhouse or apartment, I can add 1 additional unit without paying the charge. And then the last one's the local government exemption. So any charges that you have, you can't impose it on a school being built, or the county builds a building within your jurisdiction, you can't impose the charge. Similarly, they won't impose the charges on you. So it's a quid pro quo. Then we get into discretionary exemptions, and this is you as a council get to develop policies that are specific to your municipality, so things that are important. Such, for example, doing some refinements to what the definition of the industrial is. Or allowing it for any expansion. So you can reduce and hold apart the development charge. So for types of development or classes, so that could be industrial development, for example, or types of developments would be, say, places of worship, churches. If the charge is going up significantly, you could phase it in over time. And then the last one is really not discretionary, but it's actually not written in the act. It's arisen through case law, and it's called a redevelopment credit. So if I tear down my house or my house burns down, I should be allowed a period of time to replace it without having to pay a charge. Or if I got a 5,000 square foot strip mall and I want to put up a industrial building, I should get a credit for what was there before. So these are recognizing what was there as a credit. Now, all other credits and exemptions on the first page and then on this page have to be funded. So it's, if you don't have it, if you exempt certain categories, you've got to top up for the loss. Redevelopment credits, you don't have to, because all you're doing is replacing, right? So I'm tearing down one house and I'm putting up 6 townhouses. So, I've got 3 people in this house and now I'm going to have 20 people. So I should get credit for the one house. So it's you don't have to fund that redevelopment credit.
Councillor McConkey?
What if you had a motel and you want to put then townhouses or something?
Yep, it's just
for
the same thing.
Is it sort of the number of units that you had in a motel?
Generally, motels would be under a cost per square foot. And so you'd have the 5,000 square feet times $5 a square foot. That would be your credit.
Yeah, when it comes to the industrial, just for clarity on this, if I had a 100,000 square foot building and I replaced it with a 150,000 square foot building, so I'd pay in the, because I'm going to tear it down, this is where it gets confusing, I'm going to tear it down, so I wouldn't be able to trigger my 50%, but I'd get a credit for the 100,000? I'm just curious how that works.
Well, I guess it depends on the exact wording that we use. That's a very interesting one. So your current exemptions are basically colleges and universities, types of buildings and structures, religious organizations, places of worship, public hospitals, agricultural uses, so farm buildings, and other ancillary development. But right now you exclude residential uses, so it would be just associated with the farming activity. And then temporary buildings or structures are exempted from the charge. So redevelopment, normally we recognize it over a period of time. Most municipalities use 4 or 5 years. So you look backwards from when somebody's taking out the building permit, and if there was a building there, you gotta get the credit. If it was there 15 years ago, there's no credit. It's important to put a time horizon, because I remember when some municipalities were first developing this, somebody would come with a picture of a homestead from, 150 years ago and say, I should get a credit because there used to be a house there. So we've kind of scoped it now. Timing of payment, the Act gives you 2 points in time to pay. For all services, it would be the primary point in time is at the time of building permit. But for your water, wastewater, storm, and roads, we could collect it earlier at the time of subdivision. So, indexing, this is the Deputy Mayor's question. We index. Right now it's done on January 1st, so it's before the building season starts, and it's automatic. We don't have to come back. Some bylaws, councils prefer for it to say, may, and then it's got to come back for approval. Shall is probably the best, and then it's automatic. And it just adjusts with the most recent StatScan index.
So do we, I'm just curious, right now on the redevelopment, do we have a clock that runs on that, or, okay, we do, okay, thanks, carry on.
So this is local service. I've already gone through this for the most part. You understand that it's being stimulated by the no additional levies. So we're trying to draw the line. Where do we draw the line? What's the developer responsibility? I apologize for this. We were trying to make it simple, but it's certainly not simple. You've got a number of different agreements that have been entered into the past. And so what we have is, for the most part, the pink is the normal, let's say the norm on what's included as a local service. When we get up into the blue area, there are some of your charges include those items that are above, and then Midhurst agreements that you have are a little bit more unique. Okay, so that in Midhurst, for example, for water, you have water supply and treatment and storage and such that are embraced by those individual agreements where the developer will pay for it. Other areas, we're including that as a charge, so then, all the builders in that area are cost sharing for those facilities. So we spent, this is an area we spent a lot of time with staff. We are writing the policies so they basically reflect generally those agreements that you have in place today, because that locks down then what we can include in the development charge and what's the responsibilities of the developers. We're trying not to leave any gaps where there's a misunderstanding and you get into an argument on who's paying for what. Okay. So I'll let you, hopefully you can see that a little bit better on our handout rather than you can't see it better there. Well, oh, you printed the small one. Okay. We will make sure that you have a full copy. Okay? Because for this particular chart, size does matter, So that really comes with a lot of the background explanation. What I'm going to go through is just some of the things that are pertinent to this process right now, and just give you an idea of where your charges are relative to the rest of the county. So I'm approaching, the latter part of the presentation. So with most councils, when we go through the development charge process, there's always, considerations of, what do we want to have the developers pay for, and what, if any, cost do we want, any exemptions or whatever. They end up going on to the property taxpayer or through your water and your wastewater rates. So this is what it's meant to identify. As you have growth, there's going to be servicing pressures. You collect to the fullest extent you can through the DCs, but there's probably 25% of the costs are going to go here. And then are there more adjustments, deductions, reductions that you want, which may shift more onto your property taxes or water and wastewater rates. So this is during the public process where a lot of the discussions come from on ability to pay and how you're spreading the costs. The growth forecast, as we've talked about, you're primed for some considerable growth. This is a very key area. The black represents the level of building activity that you've had over the past 10 years, and we've seen it as low as 53 in 2012. We've seen it as high as 227 in 2015. So right now you're up in around the over 200. This red line just reflects the average of those 10 years, averaging at about 105 per year. You can see we're stepping up into the 200 range, and then as we move up into the 400 and then up into the 500 units per year range. The bluish color is singles, the burgundy is medium density, and then the high density is the yellow. So that's generally the forecast that we'll be working with. And that translates into over a 10-year planning horizon, about almost 4,000 units and almost 12,000 people.
Actually, just so you know, on the forecast, does that go back to the medium growth scenario, or is it, where did that get factored in? I'm just curious when I look at the numbers and that. Do they relate specifically to medium growth?
I'm pretty sure it's the medium growth.
Okay, Director Schmidt?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to members of council. I'd have to correct this with our Director of Planning, but I believe some of this information has been provided through the growth management strategy that we're currently undertaking. So I believe that's where the information is coming from. But again, we can double check that.
Okay, thank you.
Over the 15-year planning horizon, takes us roughly 2031. You can see we've got about 16,600 units. 5,600 units, which is 16,600. And then for water and wastewater, we normally look more at the kind of the build out, and we've got about 35,000 people or 13,000 units. The non-residential square footage is on the bottom, so it's 1.5 million roughly in the first 10 years, a little over 2 in the 15-year period, and about 4.6 over the longer term planning horizon. And then we've provided basically for each of the individual areas, the units and the non-residential square footage, and that'll facilitate the area-specific development charge calculations. The services that are included are basically what you have in your bylaws today. So services related to a highway, we use that term because that's what the Act uses for roads. And we do that because the definition under the Act is more expanded, so that it's really everything complete streets. So within your boundaries, the roadway boundaries. And it includes public works as well. So public works vehicles, any types of buildings and such. We've got fire, outdoor rec, which is parks and trails, indoor recreation, library, and any types of growth-related studies, and then water and wastewater.
Before I forget,
Yes.
and we don't have to go back to it, but it's more of a question. When we go back to the growth scenarios, the question I asked, when I look at the number of units, that would appear to be the high growth scenario on total units. And my concern would be, and as I said, I'll just throw it out as a concern, if we're factoring our DCs on the high growth, there's going to be lower per unit, and yet we have a lot of the big ticket items are going to occur in the next number of years. So I just throw that out as a note that you guys can look at, because the units look like the high growth in my kind of quick calculations, because on that, I guess, slide 21, additional unit increase 12,400. That would have to include the high growth scenario. So however you do it, I just challenge you that I think the DCs, when we get down to the tabulation, needs to be factored closer to the medium growth, because a lot of that activity is going to happen whether it's medium or high growth.
Okay.
So I
We'll
throw
take a
that
look
as a
into
comment. Thank you.
Yeah, I can't see from our schedules here, but we'll look into it and then we'll listen.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying the numbers you have, they are the high growth.
Okay.
That's all I'm saying. Director Schmidt?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And again, I think because we're going through the exercise of an updated growth management strategy, I think the idea is that because the numbers have changed since we did the long-range financial plan, we're a couple years out now from when the long-range financial plan was completed. So I believe that's the numbers we're basing it on is the growth management strategy. But again, I'll confirm that with our Director of Planning.
We talked about the service standards. I went through on the quality and quantity. I just wanted to show you, these are the draft calculations that we've got right now. The cost per capita has been calculated here through very similar calculations that we did. You can see when we're looking at things like services related to a highway, we got the roads, we got bridges, we've got all the different street lights, intersections and such. And then for public works, we've got the facilities and vehicles and equipment. For fire, we got facilities, vehicles, and then the firefighter gear. For parkland, we got the development of the land, amenities, trails, and then vehicles and equipment for that. Indoor rec facilities, and then library facilities and collection materials. Right now, the maximum level of service that what we could collect using the growth forecast, the draft growth forecast, and using these costs per capita, you can see that, roads probably isn't a problem whatsoever. For public works, we can probably pick up about just under $10 million over the next 15 years. For fire, we would be able to pick up about 14 million. Parks development, about another 8 million, about 12.5 million for recreation, and then about $3.5 million for library purposes. So that's what the calculations so far using this growth forecast and using your service standard. Remember, most of these services, parks, recreation, library, this is a 10-year planning horizon. For fire and public works, we're using a longer term.
Okay, and maybe I need clarification, and maybe Director Schmidt or CEO Brindley can help in that. Because I guess my understanding is a lot of the kind of the new infrastructure, like the rec center and that, is going to be funded by the development community. And we know the rec facility is going to be around $30 million, and this suggests we'd be collecting 50% of it. Or is there two funnels of revenue that come into play, or is this it? I mean, because those are going to be, because this suggests we need $18 million that the taxpayer is going to pay over the next 100 years, or whatever the case may be.
Well, one of the things we'll need to look at is, when you build that facility, is that only your needs for 10 years, or do you think that will service a longer period of time?
Oh, yeah, hopefully 25. So what you're saying basically is when we kind of update it, so yes, we could collect the 25 or 30 million over the lifespan, provided there was more.
We'd probably be able to collect it over 20 years, like the full cost over 20 years. It's just that
Okay.
the first 10 years, or as we're calculating it right now, we can pick up about 12.5. If you built it today, your service standard would start to climb, which means when I come and update it, or whoever updates it in 5 years from now, that 12.5 may be up to 16 or 17 million for a 10-year. So it'll keep increasing the amount that we can recover, and it should be able to fund the facility over, say, 15, 18 years.
Okay, that begs a good question, because, we're going to see such a dramatic change and such dramatic expenditures. Can we update it every year and look for the next 10?
You can update it as often as you want.
No, because that, quite honestly, that we may have to consider some analysis like that, because, that's a long time to be collecting, that we're borrowing the money and the finance, and
Right.
even at our wonderful low interest rates, I mean, that would at least cost, 70 by 30, 25 years would double the cost of that facility. So anyway, okay.
I have a municipality down in Niagara Region that is building a $30 million recreation complex, and they're looking to update every 2 years, the DC calculation, for just that service. We'll just come in, update it, because now the service standard, moves an extra 2 years, so, that moves along and starts influencing the amount of the recovery. So we'll basically be doing it every 2 years for them.
Yeah, we'd probably have to consider something like that. Okay, thank you. Councillor Coghlan?
Thank you, Mayor French. And for the calculation of indoor recreation, what facilities were considered in Springwater? Simply the arena, or what else was considered?
I think I saw a head nod. Director Schmidt, do you want to comment on that?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Councillor Coghlan. So it was the multi-use rec center, curling rink, and I believe community hall as well were the three items that's currently in the background study.
Follow up?
Thank you. So when we offer programming at the Anton Mills Hall or the Hillsdale Hall, when we offer camps and things like that, I think it is unique to us. Like, we do offer the $70,000 we pay every year for the city of Barrie to use their facilities. I understand that we have to come up with a capital component, but my concern is that we could be basing it too low. Like, I think the level of service that we provide our residents right now, in my opinion, isn't reflected in this. I think that there's more that we offer than what we're collecting on.
Director Schmidt? Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Councillor Coghlan. Again, I think that's part of the conversation that Mr. Scanlon was having earlier, is we need to review the actual agreement that we have with the city of Barrie and understand whether or not there is a capital component there. If there is, then that is something that we should be putting into our updated DC on a go-forward basis.
Follow up?
And the capital component of each of our small halls that provides recreation to residents, can that be incorporated in this as well?
Director Schmidt?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Councillor Coghlan. I believe Mr. Scanlon went through the quality and quantity exercise and the service standard. So what we do is we do take an inventory of all of our assets already, and I believe those facilities are already taken into account in that calculation. So the DC amount that we're collecting is for those three specific projects that I spoke of, but how we determine the amount that we're collecting is based on that inventory that we already have in place, which includes some of those facilities.
Yeah, and further to Councillor Coghlan, let's really analyze that, because we do have some unique offerings the way we do recreation compared to maybe larger municipalities. We have 5 or 6 active halls that provide recreation, and our pavilions and all those kind of things. Just want to make sure there's a balance so we don't shortchange ourselves. But yeah, I'll leave it to the experts.
Okay. Last couple of slides just give you an indication of where your charges are relative to others. For completeness, we've given you the county charges, the lower tier, which is the local municipalities, and then education DCs. So you can see the total amount that's paid when somebody comes for a single-family building permit. You can see the highest charges right now are in the Bradford, Innisfil area. They're in excess of $70,000. A lot of that driven by water and wastewater. Barrie, so this is their new area, the Salem and Hewitt areas. They're running at about $47,000 for a single detached unit. And then Collingwood, Clearview, Ramera in the mid-30s. Anton Mills, you're at about 31, and then the rest of your charges are down in the low to mid-20s. You can see that in between that you've got Wasaga, Severn, and Clearview, basically in the high 20s and low 30s.
What about the rural areas?
Yes, if it was in the, yeah, we wouldn't have the water and the wastewater. It would just be the one charge, the tax supported.
Townships versus only.
Yeah, this one here. This one here, number 20. So that would be your roads and parks, recreation, library in this charge. Yep. If we take a look at the commercial charge, county charges $34 per square foot. And then the lower tier charges, you can see, are up in the range of, sorry, this is per square meter. I'm used to seeing it as per square foot. So per square foot, it's probably running at about $3.20 per square foot, or $34 per square meter. Charges here are roughly about $21 a square foot in the at the high end. So you can see that currently you're in the say 69 to 94 range, but extends up as high as almost $265 a square meter. And then industrial, some municipalities tend to vary the industrial, or maybe you can see Ramera and Aurelia have exempted the industrial charge, so they charge $0, which means they're funding it out of their property taxes or the water and wastewater rates. You can see your charges are generally the same if it's commercial or if it's industrial. Same with most municipalities here. They have a non-residential charge. So that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to entertain any other questions, anything that I haven't covered. I'm more than happy to deal with. We will have to, as we go through, you'll consider, we'll be back with the actual calculated charges. Area rating, we've had a good conversation on that. I think it'll probably be similar to what we've done in the past. And then any policy or exemptions that you wish us to consider, I'm more than happy to work with you on that.
Councillor McConkey?
I just want to say it was great today. You're doing a great job and
thank you.
making it well worth understanding. Thank you.
Thank you very
Any other
much.
questions yet? Councillor Austin?
Thank you. Through you, Mayor French. Slides 24, 25, 26, the comparisons of DCs around the county. What is the advantage for a municipality to have lower DCs than other municipalities in the county?
I don't know if anything here is an advantage. I think a lot of this services, this reflects is the servicing cost to take care of the development. On the softer services, your libraries, your recreation, the it's capped by how much how much service you're providing today. So some municipalities provide a very low level of service, and that will be reflected in their soft service development charge. I know places like Clearview, very expensive for them. They've got to, they're servicing for something like wastewater. They have to send it from Stayner all the way down to Wasaga, and then they have to pay Wasaga for the cost of treatment. So their costs are quite expensive for wastewater. Water doesn't seem to be as much of a problem from a cost perspective.
Yeah, I guess maybe a further answer to Councillor Austin's question, if I'm a business looking around, and it doesn't matter if I'm in Springwater or Clearview or whatever, I think I'll go Springwater because my initial costs are going to be lower. Follow up, Councillor Austin?
Yes, I think that is what I was getting at. A lot of this is very, very new to me, so I'm trying to get my head around it. So that was what my question was kind of heading for. Like, if I were a developer or a builder, would I say, oh, it would be, I'll go into Springwater because the DC charges are lower? Is that a reasonable statement for me to make or assume?
for any development, it's a couple of different things. It's what's the cost of the land, and then what's the availability of that land to be serviced. Remember, if you've got if it's unserviced land, it's going to take, you're going to sit on it for a long time. So it would be a very low cost. If it's in a high serviced area, the cost for the land per acre is probably very expensive. So this doesn't necessarily reflect that added cost that a developer might have to absorb as part of just having a land mass in order to build a house. So so that's one thing. When we talk about commercial normally follows population. So it's very specific to wherever the population's growing, and it's not as much of a factor, the development charges. For industrial, it's a number of different factors. Normally DCs are at the lower end. You have to take in consideration land costs as well as the development charges. But both of those are at a lower end. Remember, when they put them into the cost of the building, then they write off that building. It's an asset, it's a value, and it's written off over time. It's depreciated. But what's of greater concern is the property taxes and water and sewer rates, because that's your day-to-day operating costs. Do you have a good labor force for your industry? Are you close to your market? And a big one is transportation. If you have to move trucks, and trucks cost you, I don't know, $150 an hour for transport trucks. If you're in the middle of the GTA and it takes you an hour to get out of there, and then an hour to get back in versus some other location, that's $150 per hour in, and $300 a day per truck, times 360 days or however number. That cost is far more costly than any development charge or land cost. So it depends on the nature of the business, it depends on their market, it depends on many, many factors. So
That was
to
good.
answer it easily, not easily answered, so.
No, that, you've put it all in perspective for me, thank you.
But I guess if someone asks a simple, oh, your DCs are high, no, not exactly. Any other questions or
The highest
comments?
charges right now are approaching $90,000. Toronto is residential, for a single attached. York Region, Markham, or City of Toronto, yeah.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. Can I have a mover and a seconder for the confirmation bylaw? Coghlan and McConkey. That bylaw 2018-008 to confirm and adopt the proceedings of council at the special meeting held on February 20, 2018. Listed here and be signed and sealed by the mayor and clerk. All those in favor? Carried. And can I have someone to move and second the adjournment? Coghlan and Austin. That the special meeting of the Township of Spring River is now adjourned at 2:28 p.m. to meet again in regular meeting on February 21st, 2018 at 5 p.m. in the Council Chambers Administrative Center, Minnesting. All those in favor? Carried. Meeting adjourned. Thank you. That was a very good presentation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.